Okay, so we have to do the discussions, and this week is the Road Safety Week, and of course, it's the annual week that is observed by the National Road Safety Commission, and we have the head of communications of the National Road Safety Commission. He's also a lawyer as well, and Kwame Tuahene. Thanks for joining me, Kwame.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Now, what's the theme for your Road Safety Week?
Empowering the passenger and pedestrian to demand road safety. We think that over time we have developed a certain tendency to look to the other person in trying to work out our safety. In as much as institutions of state like the Commission, the DVLA, the police, the agencies that construct the roads are there to carry out their duties. We want to bring the pedestrian and the passenger onto the front line so that they will begin to appreciate that safety is an issue that affects them directly. So at a point in time when you have every opportunity to let your voice be heard, you must speak up and be heard. So essentially, we sought to count on the opportunity of the week to try to raise the consciousness among passengers and pedestrians. This year we have been focused a lot on passengers. Last year we did quite some work on pedestrians. If you went to any accident ward today, Korle Bu Ward 37, as we have found over the years, and you have the opportunity to engage survivors who happen to be passengers, chances are that every 3 out of 5 of them will tell you that they made certain observations, as in either found a reason to complain. But oftentimes, characteristic of us as Ghanaians, they get into the bus, we commit ourselves to the Lord with a sign of the cross and expect that we'll get to our destination. It doesn't usually happen all the time. So it's an opportunity to learn from what these survivors have told us over time and say that if you get to a terminal and you have issues to do with the bus that has been assigned for your journey, if you are not too comfortable with the conduct of the driver, if he's on the phone, if you sense that he's taking in alcohol, if he's speeding, if he's doing needless overtaking, you just don't remain quiet in the bus and expect that you get to your destination in good time. So it's just a call on passengers and pedestrians to be responsible and get counted. If you live in a community where your pedestrian walkways have been taken over by hawkers, or your pedestrian crossing points have faded out, or you live in areas where children will have to struggle to cross from one point to school and from school to homes at the risk of being knocked down, it is important that within the community environment or setting, we will begin to engage our opinion leaders, assembly people, or the municipalities through.
So all you're saying is it is the proactiveness of the citizenry or the motorist or the passenger?
Yes, we think that in addition to all the other measures and interventions, their voices ought to be heard, because at the end of the day, the choices and decisions affect them directly. And it is only when we begin to hear them speak that certain interventions or measures will be put in place for their good. Figures are important in all we do, but Roland, the reality is that beyond the figures, safety go to affect the family. If a driver is dead today, it has consequences for his newly outdoored orphan and widow. The domestic economy suffers much as the national situation. So we want us to begin to look at safety in the sense that it's a personal responsibility, whilst public institutions are charged to do their job and their bit. Individuals, be they passenger or pedestrians, must also live a life.
You know this, we know that education is critical, and indeed you have been undertaking some level of sensitization and educational programs throughout the year. At what level would you say that you have the attention in your engagements, and especially with the other stakeholders that you tend to work with?
Attention in the sense of?
Attention of getting their mind glued to what the message should be and what their attitude should be in terms of the responses as to how they need to
In fact,
react?
Yes, that has always been a concern. The last time we did a study for related purpose was sometime in 2009 or 10, where we sought out to gauge the level of awareness of the road safety issue as far as road users were concerned. The feedback was that close to about 80% of Ghanaians were increasingly becoming aware about road safety and the messages that we communicate to them. Unfortunately, you are unable to elicit the desired attitude by education alone. That is why we try to work with other collaborators. In fact, the global best practice and examples show that you cannot achieve a lot doing education alone. You should be supported by other interventions like enforcement. In fact, education and enforcement go hand in hand, so that when you are providing the best practice issues, some other people should be mindful to ensure that the end user complies with the standards or the knowledge that you offer. That way, you begin to see improvement in very large proportions. But when you do education and you do not get the support from the other end, which is enforcement, then your work is likely to be a bit challenging. So when we look at enforcement from our perspective, the police is very crucial. But for instance, within the transport operational environment, we like to say that enforcement must start with the operator. So when people say, for instance, that we should ban the sale of alcohol at terminals, you are quick to say that if you went to STC, at the terminals across the country, they have drinking spots. But hardly do you find a driver employed by STC taking 2 alcohol whilst driving. So why should it happen with the other terminals? It is because as far as the institutional control systems are concerned, drink driving is not attractive if you're employed by STC. So it doesn't really matter. But if the operators are minded to be safety conscious.
By who?
By them.
But they'll be held stringent by, let's say, their unionized organizations,
yes,
etc.
Yes. Then, of course.
So what? By imposing fines on them?
Yeah, sanctions on them.
Okay.
Then the situation might change. Very related to that, that space. Today in our country, unfortunately, if I have money enough to buy a bus and walk to the EVLA to register the bus, I'll be asked whether I want to run the bus for private purposes or for commercial purposes. Once I get a commercial license plate, chances are that I am in business. There appear not to be sufficient control as to who gets into that roadway or that space to provide that kind of public service. So you have all kinds of people, institutions, transport organizations without sufficient control. So they tend to provide services that are not, if you like, in terms of they don't offer sufficient quality assurances, and many of the problems that we have as a result of that situation. So we need to begin to look at those concerns within that frame. Thankfully, there's a new legal regime that came into force in 2012, which says that we should begin to register the operators. So GPRTU, Portugal Cooperative, will have to be registered based on some guidelines and conditions. And out of that, some permits will be issued, so that if at the end of a year someone is not comfortable with the level of service that had come from one of these operators, then that institution or body should be willing to say that we want to suspend your license for a year until you do X, Y, Z. So those are some of the concerns that in a medium to long term, we should be interested in getting addressed. But until we get there, you and I, as patrons of the services that these institutions provide, in addition to what other agencies like the Commission does, should be interested in demanding that you are just not provided with not any service, but service that will guarantee your safety.
Well, the company I work for, the Road Safety Management Services Limited, and with you, we tend to do a lot more engagement on some of these subjects. But at what level do we need to take the engagement of the other stakeholders, not necessarily the state stakeholders, but perhaps the private, in terms of the GPRTU, in going to the length where they would have to bring a lot more of their members and non-members into account? That is, those who even engage in the industry but perhaps are not members of GPRTU or Protoa, etc.
You mean those who are not
even registered direct members?
Yes,
because there are some who are just hovering around.
They call them floating.
In local, yes, floating drivers
yes,
and operators.
Yes, we try to. It is always difficult to reach them. I mean, as an identifiable group, they are unionized like the others, so it is always difficult to get them. Except that when we use such opportunities and other direct engagement sessions in our regional operations where they strategize to meet identifiable groups, most times not in the mainstream, through other platforms like associations, churches and their likes. They try to impress on them to appreciate the need to belong to some of these groups, just so that our relevance or our purpose as far as their work is concerned could provide opportunities for us to engage. Apart from that, I mean, as far as those groups are concerned, it is extremely difficult. That is why the law again recommends that every one of them must necessarily belong to a union. If we are mindful to implement that law, we will not have the situation where you have floating drivers or drivers who decide on their own not to belong to any union, which makes control much of a difficulty.
We're getting close to the Yuletide, and we're likely to see some cases of some horrid or gorid accidents, and in such periods, we need a lot more education in that. What's the interpersonal engagement?
We are urging everyone that our choices, the choices we make in the environment, the road traffic environment, has a tendency to affect your family. I mean, Christmas is a season for well-being, compassion, and the rest of them. So we tell them, if you're a driver, that imagine that as a result of your negative choices on the road, you lose your life or suffer severe injuries. How well do you think that condition can impact on your wife and say your kid or your family, your extended and nuclear family? Again, as a passenger, if for any reason you accept just any service by a terminal, or you decide to remain quiet when even there's a compelling reason to speak up, that driver, out of overindulgence in that conduct, might lead you into some difficult condition. When that happens, imagine Christmas without you at home, or Christmas in the hospital. So we want all of us to begin to look at it within that sense. We'll continue to engage users of the road, intensify our efforts during this period, because November, December, for bad reason, to part of the accident-prone months of every year. This year, we have fairly done better in terms of the numbers, but we need to have a better grip on these last 2 months. Otherwise, the marginal gains for the last 10 months might come to nothing. So we'll continue to appeal to their conscience and let them appreciate that they all have a responsibility, however marginal it is. When we begin to embrace the positive issues we speak of often and shy away from the negative attitudes within the road environment, there's every probability that we'll end the year on a high note.
Okay. You have any to mark the period?
We are just coming out of the Road Safety Week.
Okay.
And we'll use that as a springboard to get into the Christmas sensitization program.
Right.
So across the region, my regional officers will intensify their efforts. And within the period, we're saying that everybody is his own boss. I mean, if you were a passenger, you get onto the bus, you are your boss. You are required to be observant and speak up. You are the policeman in the vehicle or at the terminal. You don't need to wait until the harm is done before you begin to share your experiences. Pedestrian drivers, those who will be going for all kinds of convention, it's about time that we begin to embrace positive road use attitudes. We all know about the kinds of conduct that will protect us, but for some strange reason, we try to shy away from them during this crucial moment. So we'll intensify efforts to remind them and all of us of the conduct that will protect us. And if we do that and get the support of other agencies like the police, that is very crucial at this point, we will be able to manage the situation fairly better.
Okay. So in December also on the show, we're going to do each week some sensitization activity. Yeah. So we know that we can always follow on you, and you will provide us with a lot more insights onto the subject of road safety. Thanks very much. Kwame Echiahene, he's a lawyer but also head of communications, the National Road Safety Commission. And thanks for joining us, Kwame.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, we're taking a break. When we come back, we're talking relationships. You know that in many instances, the relationships come to a halt because either one of the partners seem to be so much focused on one thing. Technology is good, but technology also could be very detrimental to our growth. We're talking about emotional growth. When one partner is so much glued to the mobile phone, always WhatsApping and on social media, what are the consequences? But more so, when these days you have to put in on your phone a lot more passwords and your partner can't get access. What does it mean to a relationship? Does it ensure there's transparency or not? Or should you just ignore and say, well, life goes on? We'll be having in the studio Reverend George Luttrot, and we're talking relationships up next. And we know that it's also within the period that we tend to open the phone lines for you to always get interactive.